You are listening to an After Dinner Conversation magazine podcast. After Dinner Conversation believes humanity is improved by ethics and morals grounded in philosophical truth, and that truth is discovered through intentional reflection and respectful debate. In order to facilitate this process, we have created a growing series of print books, a monthly short story magazine, and 2 different podcasts. This podcast, Philosophy, Ethics, Short Story, Audiobooks, provides readings of stories that have appeared in our magazine, and we discuss them in our companion podcast, Philosophy, Ethics, Short Story Discussions. We hope you'll continue the discussion with friends, family, and students, or head over to the comments section on our website or Facebook page. And please subscribe to our podcast, share it on social media, and suggest it to friends. Thank you for supporting us through your magazine subscriptions and through patreon.com. Links are in the description. I'm Tina Forsey, an acquisition editor at After Dinner Conversation. This story is written by Chris Burrow and was published in our August 2021 magazine. The Orphan's Dilemma. In a few minutes, they're going to say, "It's your turn, Harold." He will face Miss Wickham with her thick black frames and smiling, slightly bug-eyed look. The question more in her eyes than on her lips, because he already knows what that question is. He and the other orphans at Armstrong have thought, debated, searched, and fought about this question for the last 2 years. It has come to be as much a part of his life as the rules that govern the orphanage itself. It has dogged him through fantasy and chore, sought him in the marvelous and the mundane. And wasn't it what every orphan wanted? To wake up one day and have parents? Not only that, but to have always had them. Even now he could scarcely believe it. There was an actual medical procedure in which all the particulars of an unwanted life were whisked out of a person's very brain, and in their place was inscribed a poem, a life, written from remembered stanzas of song and semblance. It carried a cadence unknown before sleep, but whose new rhythm was as familiar as breathing upon waking. Memory surgery. The miracle whereby Harold's lifelong fantasies of sitting at a table with a group of people who had spent their entire lives knowing him could leap from the shadows of his imagination and land fully formed in the world, like a favorite character, vanishing from the page of a book and appearing in the chair next to him. Today was his chance to do it, to pull fantasy and reality inside out. He could finally banish the lonely world of Harold. The decision should be easy. Most of the other orphans had made it already. Harold peeked out from behind 3 people in front of him to watch the 4th, Jack Sullivan, approached the office door. Jack's dazzling white skin and explosion of red hair, he had heard every ginger joke the orphans could think up, and a few more besides. He was sure to opt in to the procedure and enter the orphanage's preparatory program. But weren't Harold's stories and lessons full of people who had gained strength from dealing with adversity? They became the resistance fighters, the changers of the world. If the strength to rise above the inherent cruelty of society didn't take root, what would? After all, the memories would change, but that stunningly white skin, garnet hair, and swath of freckles would still be there when Jack woke up. If Harold chose the procedure, he would wake up an utterly average 16-year-old, but the orphanage and everyone in it would be gone, replaced by memories of the family he would join after he recovered. He would never know that he had even been an orphan, that he had been Harold Smith, the rather nebbishy young man who had shared the corner room of the 3rd floor of the Armstrong orphanage with Matt Baker, Stuart Cobbler, and James Hawkins, who had nearly been thrown out of said orphanage for walking with Liz Daniels after curfew one night and sharing a single kiss under the fine green veil of a willow tree. The kiss. What about that? It would be gone. Would it be replaced by another first kiss? Surely it would be. But could it be as special as the first one? And of course the nights hidden away reading science fiction stories under the sheets. Bradbury, Gibson, and Le Guin unfolding in the folds of orphanage blankets, conjuring whole worlds where before there were none. He basked in their creations, relishing the delicacy of wonder before slipping back out to his world of lessons and tasks. And then, when he wanted to, he went back. Those were just the good memories, of course. There were nights, too, that he had spent awake in a crowded room, but alone in the universe. There were the black eye and burst lip he had suffered at the hands of the Shaw twins, and the demise of several of the aforementioned science fiction books, as well as the one story that he had actually dared to write. He still shuddered at the memory of Roger Shaw standing up and reading in a clipped sneer. Claudius Romanoff stepped from the sturdy steel ladder of his ship onto the rich red soil of Mars and proclaimed, I claim this planet in the name of the Knights of the Black Wheel. The class had burst out laughing, and even Matt and James had giggled into their hands. Harold could only stifle tears and glare at the floor. He didn't know why they did it, but at least he understood that, given the opportunity, they would do it. It was a world that he had grown to know, with all its wonders and pitfalls, but now here he was on the threshold of another. If he so chose, he would wake up after the procedure with completely different memories, probably both good and bad, but mostly happy. There would be parents that he had known all his life, and maybe even brothers and sisters. But would he know who he was? Would he be a completely different person when he came out the other side? Of course he would. His memories would be different. Would he be confident? Would he be talented? Would he be religious? Would he still like science fiction? And just as importantly, what would happen to him, Harold Smith? His memories would be gone. He would be gone. Was he ready to embrace death for the possibility of a new life? One whose exact circumstances he couldn't be sure of until he opened his eyes? The three before Harold became two as the next person shuffled to the door. It was Stuart, with his round spectacles and skinny torso, tucked into an oversized plaid jumper. He looked like someone who was mostly sure of what they wanted to do, or at least had decided on a particular course of action, but for whom a small doubt had engendered a consideration of doing something completely different at the last minute. He was motionless before the door, skull cap of blonde hair tilted with indecision. Stu was his anime buddy. Huddled over a screen on the faded bunk duvet, they devoured dozens of movies and TV shows. One week, they tried Neon Genesis Evangelion, and had quickly realized two things. One, anime loved its troubled youngsters. And two, the characters quite possibly had more dysfunctional lives than he and Stu did. Abandonment issues, secret relationships, clones, suicide, self-doubt on an epic scale. Above all, many of them had no parents, and the ones who did seemed no better off, as these parents slowly abandoned, used, or betrayed their progeny. He and Stu were gobsmacked. Was that the outside world? Was that what parents did to their children? They felt for Shinji and the other teens pushed to sync with giant bodies that they only barely controlled in an attempt to fight off mysterious creatures attacking their world for reasons they didn't understand. But what had really struck them was Shinji's struggle, his conviction that he was unnecessary. Nobody needed him. Nobody loved him. Having it be such a central part of a show that had been viewed by thousands, millions even, was like having their darkest secret exposed to a worldwide audience. They were deeply embarrassed, but awed that there were so many others who felt the way they did. What were lonely rides through a crumbling future Tokyo on the subway for Shinji were for he and Stu lonely reveries behind the orphanage, whilst taking out the rubbish. Struck to the spot by the stars on the rare, clear nights, the cold creeping into their bones, unable to look away from the celestial signs, feeling that hunger for something, someone who was never there. They longed for that sense of self that comes from knowing what others think of you, and even what you think of yourself. They wished to prove themselves, to show that they, too, were worthy of respect, admiration, love. To Stuart, the procedure offered the chance to walk into a life complete with a family of people who were ready to give those things unconditionally. You had already proved yourself. You were a necessary person, and always had been. Harold wasn't entirely sure that this would be the case, but he was wary of ruining things for Stu. The very first requirement of a dream coming true is belief in that dream, and Harold would be the last person to deny it to his best friend. He had seen the tears in Stu's eyes as he contemplated casting off the one source of goodness he had in the world, his buddies Harold and Matt and James, the sorrow that he felt at losing these friends forever, but the hope there too. The hope, and, more importantly, the belief, that on the other side of that passage lay a more beautiful world. For Stu, that hope was stronger than anything. Harold had envied him his certainty, or what he had assumed was certainty until now, seeing that tilted skull cap, that blonde indecision before the door. He wished Stu all the best. And then there was but one person left in line before Harold, as Roger Shaw left them and swaggered up to the door, the shabby carpet a catwalk for the world's biggest git. Would Roger choose according to the confidence with which he seemed to approach the world? Or would the insecurity, even self-loathing at the base of his actions cause him to opt for a change? Harold didn't know if a person like that ever would or even could admit that it was insecurity that drove him. Was Shaw even aware that it was happening, or was it just a totally unconscious jujitsu of self-hatred that ended up getting dumped on the heads of the heralds of the world? In the aftermath of every encounter with the Shaw twins, Harold's thoughts inevitably circled back to his parents. What would they have done if they had been there to raise Harold? Would he even have told them, or would he have been too embarrassed? He knew he couldn't tell the teachers about the bullying. Maybe it was the same with parents. An awkward longing to share with someone, but an underlying certitude that an adult wouldn't be able to understand. What if he went to a family with a brother like Roger? God, what if they both chose the procedure and went to the same family? That mystical word, family. The word was like the Egyptian pyramids to him. He had heard about them, seen them on documentaries, but he didn't really know anything about them. He knew more about football than he did about families. When he woke up, would he know how to be in one? Just as the absence of parents had influenced the life he had now, so too would the presence of parents determine the life he would have if he chose the procedure. They would choose what sort of memories he would be implanted with. It was scraps of their lives that would form his new reality, after all. The matching process would technically involve him. He would see their profile, maybe talk with them a bit, but he wouldn't really know them until he was part of them, and there was no going back. He would be remade in someone else's image of happiness. He wasn't sure he was comfortable with this, but perhaps that's just what having parents was like. He wondered what they might think happiness was. To him, it was the stolen excitement of a bitter black cup of coffee on a raw winter morning in the orphanage kitchen. The ache in his muscles after an hour of football with the lads. The first sentence of a news story. But he understood that happiness was not defined the same way by all people. To them, perhaps, happiness was obedience, diligence, righteousness, maybe even violence. Could someone who actually wanted to make him a part of their family be capable of such a thing? He supposed they could. It might even be the very reason that they adopted children in this manner. He shuddered at the thought, but felt that it was a relatively distant possibility. There are many reasons that a family or a set of parents might want to adopt him, even if he and the other orphans were on the older side. He had lost his parents, and perhaps there was a couple out there who had lost a son. His were not the only memories that would be altered using the procedure. By doing this, might he not also be doing something good for good people? That had to be worth something. Maybe he was just leaning too hard on his dystopian science fiction with all these worries. Why couldn't the procedure be made the very miracle it seemed? Every time Roger stuffed him into a linen closet or slapped his lunch tray out of his hands, a particular fantasy came back to him from his childhood. He was diving into a spring-fed pool so cold and clear that it was a different world. The shock of the water's chill sunk deeper than memory, affecting a marrow change that at once cleansed and etched the old and the new. When he hauled himself out, he was Harold no longer. The world felt fresh and bright, and he himself felt whole. Last, of course, was Liz. He had told her that he didn't know what he would do, and she had refused to tell him what she had decided. She turned at the door and looked at him, neither smiling nor frowning, and went in. The first thing he remembered noticing about her were her legs, which had been burned brown in the summer from days of football in the sun. They had contrasted with her otherwise pale complexion. It was absurd that this was what had drawn his eye to her, but he couldn't change it. He wasn't sure if she had always noticed him, or had only seen him once he started trying to sneak glances at her in lessons and at meal times. Somehow they had taken to looking at each other's faces when they thought the other might not be looking, then grinning sheepishly when they were caught. Then they started looking long enough to be caught. The walk with Liz that had almost gotten him into serious trouble was a timeless, handheld meandering amongst the stands of beech, birch, and ash. He wasn't sure they had said a single thing the entire walk. He couldn't remember. The only thing that could be known was that, woven somewhere in the footsteps, the quiet and the green, was a kiss. When they emerged an hour later, they were greeted at the door by bullhorns and torches. There was much discussion about what to do with them. The punishment for breaking curfew was severe, but they rarely acted out, and their good records argued for leniency. In the end, they were severely reprimanded and warned that further violations could lead to expulsion and the juvenile delinquents' hall, but were not punished with anything more serious than chores. Afterward, with the cunning of young lovers, they stole time from lessons, chores, and exercise. They read poetry in the trees. He liked Tennyson, she Elizabeth Barrett Browning. Another favorite of hers was Wisława Szymborska. In the Polish poet's Nobel lecture, she had talked about how poets must always say, "I don't know," and how each poem is an attempt to address this fact. But each time the poet comes to the inevitable conclusion that the response hasn't changed a thing. It occurred to him then that what was called life was what each person did in response to this statement. One's personal poetry of action and speech and emotion, the inadequacy of all these answers and responses, and the inevitable dissatisfaction with the world for not having them. His choice would alter him, but not the world. Liz walked out of the office, a smile curled into one pale cheek, and disappeared down the hallway. His thoughts swirled now with time, memory, pain, and hope. The tarnished known, a manipulated future, fantasies for which he did not yet have language. They all whispered to him, showing him their ghost-thin skeins branching and flowing from events and decisions waiting to be made. There, they had called his name. Ms. Wickham faced him with her thick black frames and smiling, slightly bug-eyed look. "Okay, Harold, have you made your choice?" He straightened his shirt, smoothed his trousers, and smiled back. "Yes, Miss Wickham, I believe I have." Discussion questions. 1. What is the best possible outcome when a child is adopted? Does giving them different memories make that outcome more or less likely? 2. Harold, the orphan, is struggling with choosing, at least in part, the happiness of a mind free of difficult past experiences, and the attachment and value of those experiences. Given the same choice, are there past difficult experiences you would choose to forget? 3. What if the procedure were required prior to adoption? Would you choose to continue in a difficult situation in an orphanage or accept the procedure so you could be adopted? 4. Are there painful experiences which provide no value to the person and therefore could acceptably be erased? What might those experiences be? 5. Is the ultimate purpose of life painful experiences and growth, or the happiness that comes from a spotless mind? What do you think? Let's continue the discussion on our companion podcast, After Dinner Conversation Discussions, and in the comments section on our website or on Facebook. Links are in the description. Thank you for joining us, and we hope to hear from you soon.